This episode wasn't supposed to happen. However, when I finished lagging the boiler in episode 15, I thought I'd better see how the dummy cylinder block would fit, and discovered that when I'd made the pattern, I'd overlooked the fact that the block would sit further back as the smokebox saddle bolts acted as stops inside the smokebox, thus making the boiler come further back. The result was the dummy block needed a 10mm extension piece adding on. Not too much of a problem, just a spare casting, cut it up, can move that on later. However, the major problem was the safety valve cum filler was too low into the block now to be able to tighten it up. And the project sat on the bench staring at me. I spent a considerable amount of time looking at options, including new safety valves or some sort of tool for tightening it up. And in the end, I decided to make up a brass extension piece. These issues, while resolvable, stalled the rebuild. This cutaway drawing should help explain the issues. The condensate trap is on the front of the boiler, with the end removed earlier on in the build. It gives us the space to bolt the smoke box to the boiler without interfering with the water space in the boiler itself. And this is where it comes up to the smoke box saddle bolts, acting as a stop. The extension piece fits inside the dummy cylinder, raising the safety valve enough so that it was able to tighten it up with the dummy block removed, the whole item acting as a safety valve cover. So first I unsoldered the safety valve bush in a spare boiler to see if that would come out easily, which it did eventually, but I was concerned that with a hit as this is a soft soldered boiler, I might unsolder with a boiler front tube plate, so that in the end decided to make a bush as a tight fit. Having located some 12mm brass bar stock, I then set to turn up a blank. The new version of the Walesko boiler uses a 6mm by 0.75 thread pitch, whereas the older boiler uses a M6 by 1 thread pitch, so I'd need to make both versions. Once the bush had been turned to size for the 7mm insert, cut off at 9.5mm, it was then drilled to 5mm tapping size and tapped for an M6 thread to match the safety valves. Once this was complete, it was time to see if it fitted the spare boiler first, which it did. So next I stripped off the cladding, removed the gauge glass and rubber seals from the talisman, then drilled out the threaded insert for 7mm. I then pre-soldered the new extension brass insert and soldered this in place. Once this had cooled off, the boiler was given a thorough clean out to remove flux and any foreign matter from drilling the bush. Ready for a steam test. Fitted the safety valve in the extension piece and fitted the whistle along with the spare regulator valve. Having raised some steam, I was happy to see that nothing leaked and the safety valve lifted at the required 15 psi, which is a rated setting on these valves. Then it was time to reassemble the boiler, refit the smoke box, cladding. All in all, this saw some 2 hours work from start to finish, and now it was on to dealing with the next one. Once both engines had been modified, it was time to turn my attention to the next issue, the dummy cylinder block mount. As mentioned before, this was now too short, so with the aid of a spare base, I marked out and cut off the front section, silver soldered this together, plugging any unwanted holes in the process, and then with a Dremel and a drum sander, surface ground the parts back to match. Once I was happy with the fit, I marked out the location of the screw holes for the dummy motion guard to the rear of the cylinder block. Drilled these for 8BA and countersunk the holes with a 5mm drill bit, touching lightly down on the surface. Assembled these with some short 8BA set screws. Next, I placed the cylinder block on the base and offered up the engine frame to see how they fitted, which was rather tight. Placed the cylinder detail set on the Walesko cylinder and found the slide valve side cover plate fouled the dummy cylinder block. So I marked out the offending section, cut it off as this didn't affect the actual fitting. Then with the dummy cylinder block fitted with a safety valve, this rendered the safety valves on the cylinder detail set redundant. So I cut off the valve stems, filed the top flat, marked out and re-drilled for the bolt heads, and using some scrap 10BA bolts, cut these down so I could solder these in place to complete the detail. Whilst this was all going on, at the same time I marked out the position for the firebox side footboard bracket. This was duly drilled and painted in heatproof satin black. So that concludes this episode, so don't forget to subscribe and follow this project.